Dr. Chris Hart shares with us his strong opinions on the relationship between marriage and religion. First, Dr. Chris Hart believes that in the medieval Europe, the church had no interest in marriage, but it was deemed to be a community affair. As he puts it, the verse in the Bible, "What God has put together, let no man asunder," was apparently added to give the church more influence in the state affairs.
That only came to be in sort of 1500, when the church began to say that a wedding is a sacrament and started to argue that it should all be done in church and so on. Prior to that, that wasn't the case. Well, it was just part of the liturgy for the service. It was put together by the people who wrote the liturgy. Well, you're getting onto deep stuff here, but if you look back into the ancient church, there's no sign of any marriage or wedding or anything like that at all. It all developed in around about 11, 12, 1300 in medieval Europe. Prior to that, nobody had any interest. Weird, isn't it? The proposal, by the way, is quite modern. If you go back to, say, 1200 AD, there weren't really church weddings. There weren't legal marriages in Europe. If a couple said in front of witnesses that they wished to be married, then they were married. So long as they could find somebody who would say, "I saw these people exchange vows," then it was a marriage, and it was recognized completely. And what happened gradually after that is that the church began to lay down rules as to who could marry and what the circumstances were and so on. And so gradually the actual exchange of vows and the intent got separated. And so you had to agree privately, which became the proposal, before you went and agreed publicly, if you see what I mean. But go back far enough and it was all one and the same. You and I could be having a drunken evening in a bar and decide to get married. And because there were witnesses, we were married. Those days, if you agreed the agreement in front of witnesses was all that was needed. Go right back to 1200. Yeah. A little bit later, in the church service, the kiss was incorporated as the contract. You see, you've got to bear in mind that prior to about 11, 12, 1300, neither the state nor the church was interested in weddings at all. The wedding wasn't a sacrament. That came later. The law wasn't interested. What people did privately was nobody's business. The local community was passionately interested, but the state wasn't. In my more cynical moments, I think it's not an accident that the church of the day recognized that marriages were an enormously powerful institution, that they linked together rulers and countries and all the rest of it. And for the church to have an influence on how that happened would increase its own power. So I'm afraid it was politics. Originally, people didn't wear rings. The ring started as a part of the negotiation about the price for the bride. At the time when this started, rings were currency. People actually made gold and silver into rings, and they weighed it. And it used to be traditional to give the girl a ring as part of that negotiation. You see what I mean? Some of the rings along the way have been rather lovely. There was a thing called a gimel ring. Now, a gimel ring was like a ring that had been split into three, so that you had three rings. And it had a rough edge so that only one ring could fit together. So now, he would have one of them, put it on his little finger. She would wear another one. And the third one would be given to a witness. And the three of them would go about their lives until the negotiations were over. And then they would all be put back together on her finger. That's rather nice, isn't it? And the dowry is interesting because different cultures do different things with dowry. Some cultures, the man pays money to the bride's family. Some cultures, the bride's family pays money to the new family, ostensibly for her. And what's very interesting is that you can predict which is going to happen in any given culture. Because in any culture where, in antiquity, the ground was always tilled by women with hoes, then dowry will be paid to her family. Where the ground is tilled with ploughs by men, it'll be the other way around. And that's universal. I don't know of a single culture that differs from that. It's worth talking about things like, why does she go into the church with her father and then swaps arms, and now she's married and comes out with her intended? In the old days, that really was a legal transfer of power, because she belonged to her father until she was married, and then she belonged to him. And when you say in the service, who gives this woman to be married to this man, that had real legal significance. Go back 1,000 years. You see what I mean? And of course, go back a bit further and real money would have changed hands. In fact, would you believe it was possible to buy and sell wives in England as late as 1880? Yeah, literally. The last occasion that I'm aware of that somebody sold his wife to somebody else. The bride stands to the left of the groom. You remember that? And you remember how the families are separated. Yes? In every other church, people mingle, don't they? Every other service, but not in the wedding. And so the reason, of course, is because, as is the case in a lot of traditions all around the world, there wasn't a proposal in the traditional sense. Couples didn't get to know one another and make a decision. What actually happened was a couple would get to know one another and decide they wanted to be married, and then he would kidnap her. Because if he didn't kidnap her, endless arguments would start between the families and a lot of money would be involved. So the simple way out of it was to get a bunch of your friends together, and catch her one night and take her away. So the best man was the captain of your little band, and the ushers were the others. And you would grab this girl, with her consent, by the way, and then you'd head for the hills. Now that's the reason why we never say where we're going on our honeymoon, because the honeymoon used to be before the wedding. Now it's rather more decorous, it's after the wedding. But in the old days, you would grab your bride, head for the hills, and stay out of sight for as long as it took. And then when all the tempers had calmed down, and it was quite obvious that she was not a maiden any longer, then you would sheepishly come back and start negotiating. But the families would have to come to an agreement now. So it made sure that there was going to be an agreement. Get the idea? Because the families probably didn't like each other too much, still, after all the negotiations. And the ushers keep them apart when they're kept apart on the two sides of the church. So the ushers are the remnants of the little private army that you used to go and kidnap your bride. And the bridesmaids are the remnants of the friends who confused the evil spirits. And in the old days, she did not carry flowers. She carried wheat. And a little girl would walk in front of her, scattering petals on the ground in front of her. Yes? And that was, again, evil spirits and all the rest of it, make the way safe for her to walk. But she would carry wheat or some similar grain as a symbol of fertility. And after the ceremony, that little bit of wheat would be ground up and made into a little cake. And it would be thrown at people and people would eat it. And it was the origin of the wedding cake. But originally it was only a tiny thing, you know what I mean?